Is anyone else starting to feel like something is deeply off about our parents' generation? It's not that they didn't put in the effort. They absolutely worked hard. But many of them never really mapped out what retirement would look like. Instead, they crossed their fingers, assumed things would fall into place, and put their faith in the system to carry them through. Now, that lingering uncertainty is quietly rolling downhill and landing squarely on the generations behind them. These thoughts aren't radical or fringe anymore. They're becoming everyday worries shared by people of almost every age. Baby boomers and Gen X are already coming to terms with a tough reality. If they didn't start saving early, there may be no smooth or graceful way out of the workforce. Millennials are watching living costs skyrocket while paychecks struggle to keep up. And Gen Z is stepping into adulthood facing one of the harshest job markets in decades, weighed down by debt long before retirement even feels like a real concept. But this goes deeper than dollars and cents. What's really happening is the slow erosion of a promise that once defined adulthood itself. The idea that if you work hard, follow the rules, and do what you're told, you'll eventually earn the right to rest. That promise is cracking, and most people don't recognize just how fragile it's become until the damage is already done. By the end of this video, you'll see why retirement is quietly slipping out of reach for the majority of people, and why pretending this isn't happening may be the most dangerous financial mistake you can make. For much of the 20th century, retirement followed a predictable path that most people understood without needing a financial handbook. You showed up, worked diligently, stayed loyal to one employer, and in exchange, there was a clear expectation of security waiting at the end of your career. Pensions were common, Social Security existed as a fallback, and if you managed things responsibly, your home was often paid off by the time you clocked out for the last time. That system didn't demand advanced money skills or constant decision-making. What it asked for was consistency. Go to work, do what was expected, avoid major mistakes, and let the structure handle the long-term outcome. For a while, that approach worked. But quietly, over the last few decades, that promise has unraveled. Pensions have largely vanished from the private sector, replaced by the 401k, a tool that transferred nearly all the responsibility and the risk onto individual workers. Suddenly, market swings, contribution rates, investment choices, and personal discipline mattered more than loyalty ever had. At the same time, the idea of job stability began to crack. Layoffs became common. Career paths grew messy and unpredictable. Instead of spending 30 years with one company, people found themselves forced to start over every few years, often through no choice of their own. Each restart came at a cost: lost momentum, interrupted compounding, and in many cases, savings that never fully recovered. Social Security was never meant to shoulder the full burden of retirement, but as other supports weakened, more people leaned on it anyway. The outcome is a generation approaching retirement with no pension, volatile investment accounts, mortgages that aren't fully paid off, and a safety net that was never designed to hold all that weight alone. Retirement didn't become more difficult because people stopped working hard. It became more fragile because the system that once rewarded long-term stability quietly disappeared, and most people didn't realize it was gone until there was no time left to adapt. For many Americans, Social Security has slowly shifted from being a helpful supplement into something much closer to a financial lifeline. Talk to almost anyone who's getting close to retirement and ask what their plan looks like, and you'll usually hear a familiar response: "We'll get by on Social Security." That's where the trouble starts. The program was never designed to shoulder that kind of responsibility. At its foundation, Social Security was meant to replace only a slice of a worker's income, about 40% for the average retiree. Today, the typical monthly check falls somewhere between roughly $1,700 and $1,900. That amount can help with basics like groceries or utility bills, but it was never intended to fully cover housing, healthcare, transportation, and the steadily rising cost of everyday life for decades after leaving work. What makes this even more precarious is how many people now rely on Social Security as their main source, or sometimes their only source, of retirement income. As pensions disappeared and personal savings failed to keep pace with inflation, Social Security quietly turned into the final backstop. When a safety net is pushed far beyond what it was built to handle, even small weaknesses can turn into serious risks. On top of that, there's growing unease about the system's long-term outlook. If nothing changes, projections suggest future benefits could eventually drop to about three-quarters of what's been promised. That doesn't mean Social Security vanishes, but it does mean retirees may be forced to live on even less than an already tight baseline. The real crisis isn't that Social Security itself is collapsing. It's that the rest of the retirement system broke down first, leaving millions of people balancing on a platform that was never meant to support them alone. And if there's one quiet force steadily dismantling retirement plans without grabbing headlines, it's inflation. Not the dramatic kind of inflation that sends markets crashing overnight, but the quiet, relentless kind that slowly chips away at your buying power year after year. It doesn't show up waving a warning sign or declaring itself a crisis. Instead, it nudges prices higher little by little, until a little more quietly turns into something you can't manage anymore. 30 years ago, many people believed that hitting $1 million meant you were set for life. Today, that milestone doesn't stretch nearly as far. Food costs more. Housing is more expensive. Utilities, insurance, transportation, and healthcare all rise steadily in the background. What once felt like a comfortable cushion now often buys you time, nothing more. That's why so many retirees talk about watching their savings slowly drain away. It isn't always the result of reckless spending. In many cases, their money sat in places chosen for safety rather than growth. Bank savings accounts, CDS, and other low-yield options feel reassuring, but over long periods, inflation quietly erodes their real value. On paper, the balance may look familiar. In reality, it buys far less than it used to. The irony is harsh. Playing it safe can turn into a risk of its own. But embracing risk isn't straightforward either. Markets are unpredictable, and retirees don't have decades to wait out downturns the way younger investors can. This is the corner modern workers are backed into. Save too cautiously, and inflation slowly wins. Take on too much risk, and one badly timed market drop can undo years of planning. Inflation doesn't just raise prices, it turns retirement planning into a constant tightrope walk, where even making smart, responsible choices no longer guarantees security. And one of the most uncomfortable realities of the retirement crisis is that it doesn't hit everyone equally. Every generation has stepped into adulthood under different economic conditions, and with each shift, the odds have quietly grown worse. For many baby boomers, the road ahead felt relatively straightforward. Paychecks tended to rise alongside productivity, housing was far more affordable relative to income, and employer pensions were still a normal part of the deal. Spending decades with the same company wasn't unusual, and while retirement was never automatic, it felt within reach if you played by the rules. Gen X entered adulthood right as that foundation began to crack. They were sold the same expectations, but the landscape was already changing beneath their feet. Pensions started disappearing just as they hit their peak earning years. Job security weakened, and many lived through multiple recessions, layoffs, and unexpected career interruptions. As a result, a large number found themselves in their 50s with unfinished retirement plans and far less confidence than their parents ever had. Millennials faced an even tougher environment. Housing prices surged far beyond wage growth, student loan debt became a defining part of early adulthood, and stable, long-term employment turned into the exception rather than the rule. For many in this group, retirement stopped feeling like a clear destination and started to feel more like a theory, something distant, abstract, and possibly out of reach. Gen Z is watching all of this play out in real time. They're stepping into a workforce shaped by instability, automation fears, and high living costs from day one. Instead of inheriting optimism about the future, they're inheriting cautionary tales. Many aren't asking how to retire well. They're questioning whether retirement will exist at all. That's why the retirement crisis in America feels so widespread. It's not just individual struggle. It's the reality that each generation is starting from a weaker position than the one before it. Which is why the idea that most people may never retire starts to feel less like doom and gloom and more like recognizing a clear pattern. Lately, one number has been making the rounds and stopping people in their tracks: $3 million. Some estimates suggest that's what it could take to retire comfortably at the traditional age of 65. For many, hearing that figure doesn't feel like helpful advice. It feels like getting punched in the stomach. At first glance, the math alone is overwhelming. Spread over a roughly 45-year working life, that total suggests setting aside tens of thousands of dollars every single year. Most people simply don't have that kind of extra cash, especially while managing rent or mortgages, healthcare costs, family obligations, and the ever-rising price of everyday life. To make it sound more achievable, the conversation usually shifts to investing. You're told you don't have to save it all yourself. Compound growth will do most of the work. With a steady average return, the monthly contribution drops to a few $100s. On paper, that seems reasonable. But this is where the illusion creeps in. Those projections depend on a level of stability that many people never experience. They assume uninterrupted careers, consistent contributions, and decades of cooperative markets. They leave no room for long layoffs, health emergencies, caregiving responsibilities, or periods where simply staying afloat matters more than saving. For millions of workers, those assumptions don't match real life. The $3 million figure isn't meant to discourage people, but that's often exactly what it does. Instead of inspiring action, it freezes people in place. When the gap between where someone is and where they're told they should be feels impossible to bridge, many quietly stop trying. The real danger isn't that the number is large. It's that it convinces people they've already failed long before retirement even becomes a reality. For a long time, the standard advice around retirement has been almost too simple. Just invest. Put your money into the market, keep contributing, stay patient, and eventually everything will sort itself out. For earlier generations, that guidance often proved true. Long-term growth helped smooth over market crashes, and sticking it out through downturns usually paid off in the end. But that reassurance doesn't land the same way today. Younger workers understand the logic behind investing, yet many feel uneasy about the environment they're being asked to rely on. Major stock indexes are now heavily concentrated in a relatively small group of technology companies. Entire market surges are often driven by a handful of narratives, artificial intelligence, automation, or speculative growth, that can feel fragile rather than firmly grounded in broad economic strength. When returns depend more on momentum than fundamentals, confidence becomes harder to hold on to. There's also a timing issue that rarely gets enough attention. Investing works best when time is on your side, but retirement doesn't offer unlimited runway. A major market downturn early in retirement can permanently weaken a portfolio, a problem known as sequence of returns risk. Even if markets rebound years later, the damage may already be locked in because withdrawals happened during the worst possible stretch. That's why telling people to just invest often comes across as dismissive. It overlooks the emotional strain of volatility and ignores the structural reality that many workers don't have decades of uninterrupted growth ahead of them. Investing is still necessary, but it no longer feels like a guarantee. The fear isn't that markets will collapse forever. It's that the margin for error has become razor thin, and one badly timed downturn can undo a lifetime of disciplined effort. And when most people picture retirement, they're not thinking about charts and risk models. They're imagining travel, hobbies, or finally being able to slow down. What most people don't picture, at least not until they're forced to, is healthcare. And when it finally comes into focus, it often turns out to be the single biggest expense they never truly planned for. Even with Medicare, retirement healthcare is anything but free. Monthly premiums, deductibles, co-pays, prescription drugs, and services that aren't fully covered start stacking up fast. Over the span of retirement, it's not unusual for a typical couple to face healthcare costs that climb well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's before long-term care even enters the conversation. This is where the gap between expectations and reality becomes especially dangerous. Medicare doesn't cover extended stays in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. Those costs can reach thousands of dollars per month, and they rarely arrive gently. A fall, a serious diagnosis, or a slow loss of mobility can turn what felt like a stable retirement into a financial crisis almost overnight. The timing makes it even more unforgiving. Healthcare expenses tend to surge precisely when income flexibility vanishes. You can't simply work extra hours or pivot careers to make up the difference. Instead, you're pulling from savings that were meant to last decades, and one prolonged medical issue can drain them far faster than anyone anticipated. This is why so many retirement plans fall apart. Not because people were careless with money, but because they were unlucky. Illness doesn't care how disciplined you were in your 30s or how carefully you followed the rules. And when healthcare becomes the deciding line between stability and survival, the idea of a comfortable retirement starts to feel far more fragile. For earlier generations, housing once served as the anchor of retirement security. By the time people stopped working, their homes were often fully paid off. With housing paid off, monthly expenses dropped sharply. Shelter became a known, predictable cost, and that stability allowed everything else, Social Security, savings, even a bit of part-time income, to stretch much further. That kind of foundation can no longer be taken for granted. Today, far more people are heading into retirement without owning their homes outright. Some are still carrying mortgages deep into their 60s. Others have spent their entire lives renting, exposed to rent increases that don't slow down just because their income does. And even homeowners aren't living expense-free. Property taxes rise. Insurance costs climb. Maintenance doesn't disappear with age. It usually gets more expensive. For millennials and Gen Z, the challenge is even more severe. Many were priced out of homeownership during their strongest earning years. Others pushed themselves to the limit just to buy, locking into decades-long financial obligations that collide head-on with retirement timelines. Housing, once the stabilizing force, has turned into another major uncertainty. The risk here is quiet but serious. Housing costs don't politely adjust to retirement budgets. They keep rising while income becomes fixed. A paid-off home used to act as a shield against inflation. Renting or carrying long-term debt turns inflation into a constant pressure instead. That's why stories of older adults taking on roommates or moving into shared living arrangements are becoming more common. It's not about lifestyle preference, it's a financial adjustment, and a clear signal that the traditional relationship between housing and retirement has fundamentally shifted. At a certain point, statistics stop feeling abstract and start showing up as real faces, real voices, and real lives. The retirement crisis isn't a future possibility. It's already unfolding in everyday experience. You can see it in people in their 50s who quietly admit they've saved nothing at all, even after decades of steady work. You hear it in the stories of employees laid off late in their careers, suddenly forced to burn through whatever little they had just to get by. And you feel it most clearly in the growing number of people in their 70s, and even their 80s, who are still working, not because they enjoy it, but because they simply can't afford to stop. These aren't rare exceptions. They're early warning signs. Shared living arrangements, community housing, and Golden Girls-style setups are no longer fringe ideas. For many older adults, they've become financial necessities. The vision of aging independently, alone, comfortable, and without constant financial stress is steadily slipping out of reach. What's striking is how often these stories are marked by regret, not excess. Most of these people didn't live carelessly. They raised families, paid their bills, and followed the advice they were told was responsible. The system just failed to deliver what it once promised. This is the real human cost of the retirement crisis. It isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's postponed dreams, longer working lives, and the quiet anxiety of wondering whether your savings will last as long as you do. And for younger generations watching all of this unfold, it feels less like a cautionary tale and more like a preview of what's coming. As the idea of a stable retirement drifts further out of reach, a subtle psychological shift has taken hold, especially among younger people. When the future feels uncertain or outright unattainable, the motivation to sacrifice today starts to weaken. That's where doom spending enters the conversation. Doom spending isn't about recklessness in the traditional sense. It's a coping strategy. When people come to believe that careful saving still won't buy them real security, spending becomes a way to regain a sense of control right now. Experiences, convenience, and small comforts start to feel reasonable, not because they're truly affordable, but because the future feels shaky and unreliable. Social media pours fuel on this mindset. Endless feeds of polished lifestyles, luxury travel, high-end cars, and soft life narratives blur the line between inspiration and expectation. Credit cards step in to bridge the gap between income and desire. Those small monthly payments seem harmless at first, until they quietly pile up and turn into long-term limitations. What makes this cycle especially dangerous is how self-reinforcing it becomes. The more people spend to numb anxiety, the thinner their financial cushion grows. The thinner that cushion gets, the more impossible retirement planning feels. And the more impossible it feels, the easier it is to justify spending even more. This isn't a moral shortcoming. It's a logical reaction to a system that appears stacked against long-term restraint. Rational or not, the outcome doesn't change. Doom spending doesn't just postpone retirement. It actively speeds up the conditions that make retirement unreachable. The real tragedy is that many people see this pattern clearly and still feel trapped inside it. They understand the math. They know the consequences. What they don't see is a future that feels compelling enough to sacrifice for. And that may be the most unsettling signal of all. At some point, the conversation around retirement has to move away from what it once was and toward what it's realistically becoming. For many people, retirement will no longer mean a clean break from work. It won't resemble decades of leisure supported by a single, neatly packaged nest egg. Instead, retirement is slowly turning into something much more fluid and flexible. The emerging reality isn't about completely walking away from work. It's about easing financial pressure over time. It's less about total freedom and more about adaptability. Part-time income, consulting, remote roles, or project-based work are increasingly becoming essential pieces of how people expect to make their later years work. Not because they dream of working forever, but because full financial independence feels harder and harder to reach. This shift isn't automatically a bad thing, but it does mark a clear break from the promise earlier generations were given. The real risk comes from pretending that the old model still applies. When expectations don't align with reality, people make flawed plans, postpone difficult choices, and underestimate how long their money actually needs to last. The uncomfortable truth is that the future of retirement will reward flexibility. Those who can adjust, scale back assumptions, and design lives that can pivot will be better positioned than those holding on to a version of retirement that no longer exists. This isn't about surrender. It's about redefining the goal before the goal ends up redefining you. The retirement crisis in America didn't appear out of nowhere. It's the result of rising costs, risk being pushed onto individuals, unstable career paths, and a system that no longer functions the way people were told it would. Inflation, healthcare expenses, housing pressures, and market uncertainty have reshaped retirement into something far more fragile than most people expect. This isn't meant to stir fear. It's about seeing things clearly. Holding on to the belief that the old retirement model still works only postpones tough choices and shrinks the options you'll have later. Recognizing why most people won't retire the way earlier generations did is the first step toward adjusting to what's actually ahead. And if this helped bring things into focus, consider subscribing, because the future favors those who prepare for reality rather than ignore it.